the biggest threat we face as journalists here is the constant abuse that some of our journalists get. A lot of that litigious approach, and there's one journalist in particular who I think about when I talk about this, who has ended up in court on the other side of a lawsuit against a former president. You can't try to muzzle a journalist because you don't like what they're saying. It's got to be based on something if you're going to take a journalist to court.
Technology will continue doing what it does, which is evolve. And so journalism, the tenets of journalism remain the same. It's just adapting to the medium.
Ordinary citizens around the world know where to get credible news they can trust, news that they know is true, and news that doesn't have an agenda. So much of what is on social media has very clear, sometimes hidden, but often very clear political agendas or just commercial agendas, all kinds of agendas.
Welcome to the Executive Connect podcast. Today, I'm excited to talk about the future of journalism, some challenges, ethics, and innovation. And here with me today is three amazing guests. Judy, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, thanks, Melissa. I'm a former broadcast journalist and editor. I worked for the public broadcaster for many years, doing lots of different kinds of stories, from politics and boxing to rugby, etc., but a lot about women because there were big gaps in reporting on women's issues and women's rights. And I'm a founder editor of the South African National Editors Forum and serve on the various committees, media freedom, diversity and ethics, and as a KwaZulu-Natal convener, because I feel passionate about facilitating quality journalism and also connecting with my comrades in arms, as it were, in the Editors Forum to defend media freedom and promote transformation and really make sure we deliver a better news product for everyone who listens or reads or watches news or whichever platform they get it on.
Thank you so much, Judy, for sharing a little bit about you. Katy, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, Melissa. Thanks for having us here today. I have been a journalist and an editor for over 20 years, running newsrooms, mainly in broadcasting, radio and television. And I'm also the chairperson of SANEF's Journalism, Safety and Wellness Committee. SANEF is the South African National Editors Forum, and it's an amazing body that fights for media freedom, that fights for rights of journalists. And essentially, we have formed this committee as a result of many, many years of, I think, neglecting safety and neglecting mental wellness in the space of journalism.
Thank you so much, Katy, for sharing that. Qaanitah, can you share a little bit about yourself and your background?
Thank you very much, Melissa. My name is Qaanitah Hunter. I am a political editor in South Africa. I have been in the space for a while, and I became a manager at a very young age, and I realized the need for mental health support through my own journey as a young journalist, but also seeing the experience of my peers. So I participate quite closely with what SANEF does, and I have just started what is called Debrief the Media, an initiative to promote mental wellness among journalists and in newsrooms.
Thank you so much for sharing a little bit about yourself. I'm excited to jump in and talk a little bit about journalism. And Katy, I want to get your perspective. Journalism has changed a lot over the last years. The digital age has redefined how we consume news, how we get it, social media platforms. Often I wonder myself what's real and what's not in the media today. So I want to get a little bit from you about, you've led major newsroom transformations. You've been the biggest shift in journalism over the past decade. Can you share a little bit about your thoughts on how journalism is changing?
Well, there's absolutely no doubt that the landscape that we work in has changed dramatically over the past 10, 15 years or so. When I was a cub and a junior reporter all those years ago, it was very much about what you saw, eyewitness accounts, what you reported on. The reality is today that everybody with a smartphone is a journalist, and we've got citizen reporters popping up just everywhere. And so our role as journalists is an absolutely critical one. In fact, I think more critical now than ever, and I know that there's a whole narrative that's happening the world over that says, mainstream media, legacy media, they're losing their gravitas. I don't believe that at all. I think that well-trained and professional journalists now are far more important than ever before, because it helps you wade through what is and what isn't factual. You said it yourself, Melissa. You're not sure what to believe anymore. So if you're able to follow and consume news from respected, credible, independent journalists, then I think you're on the right track. And the reality is, we're hoping that our audience is also well informed and well read. Don't put all your trust in one person or one newsroom or organization 100% of the time. Be discerning, read everywhere. And so I think that the transformation we've seen in journalism is all about that. And it is about rebuilding trust to a certain degree, because I do think that, there has been a bit of a breakdown of trust.
Are you a high-income professional looking for smarter ways to protect your wealth from inflation and taxes? The Texas Freedom Fund gives you the opportunity to invest in energy assets, leveraging proven fracking technology and prime access to global markets. With strategic oil and gas investments, you can build real wealth while benefiting from tax advantages under laws dating back to the Reagan era. Take control of your financial future. Visit executiveconnectpodcast.com to learn more. That's executiveconnectpodcast.com.
Because some of that narrative has been very anti-media and very anti the established media in favor of citizen journalism, which has its place, and I'm not going to take away from it. But is it true? And that's the big question that readers and viewers need to ask themselves all the time. Is what I'm reading on social media platforms like X and TikTok and watching on Facebook, is it true? And who is saying it? Because if we were to believe all the conspiracy theories and everybody who had something to say, I think it would be a very dangerous place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's tricky now these days. I appreciate you sharing your insights. And Qaanitah, you've worked across print, digital, television. Do you think the rise of online platforms has strengthened or weakened journalism from your perspective?
I think that medium has evolved as long as journalism exists. I mean, back in the day, the way newspapers were printed was, stamped on paper. I don't recall it. I was not alive. But essentially, technology will continue doing what it does, which is evolve. And so journalism, the tenets of journalism remain the same. It's just adapting to the medium. And I think that what traditional media has delayed in that transition, particularly because of being precious about the way that we're doing things. And so when there's a disconnect between the medium in which we use, because today it's smartphones and it's vertical video and it's social media platforms, tomorrow it may be a VR lens on your screen. And so the idea then is to delink the tenets of journalism from the medium that's currently in vogue, and then to say that how do we adapt to how people consume information.
Yeah, it's so true. I keep thinking, I'm like, maybe one of these days we could just stand in front of our TVs and talk at the TV, and we don't even need to hold our hands in our phones anymore. We're going to have, be able to feel like we're in front of people. And so it is interesting what's going to happen with innovation and technology. Judy, I'm curious from your perspective, broadcast journalism has had significant changes with the dominance of streaming and digital platforms. Where does traditional broadcasting fit in now?
Well, I was involved in launching news on multiple platforms for the public broadcaster some years back. And there was resistance from traditional media, the radio and television, my radio and television colleagues initially, until they realized that, in fact, digital platforms are very complementary. For example, I set up news on cell phones in several countries across Africa, including South Africa, and in different languages, and also news on electronic billboards and at airports. And then you find that the different platforms can complement each other. And to get back to what Qaanitah's saying, we get a lot on our smartphones now, an awful lot. But the thing that remains the same is the quality of journalism is so important. And newsrooms are so shrunken. The big companies like Google and Facebook have taken away a lot of advertising from traditional media outlets. Now, the newspapers, maybe they were a bit slow to start off to get digital. Radio and television, we were a bit faster, but especially in radio. But there's no doubt that newsrooms are struggling worldwide, globally. And yes, we will be getting practically all of our news on digital platforms in future. We already are in many ways. But the problem is we're getting so much other noise as well on social media, on so many different platforms, new ones coming all the time. So what Qaanitah and Katy are saying, so important that ordinary citizens around the world know where to get credible news they can trust, news that they know is true, and news that doesn't have an agenda. So much of what is on social media has very clear, sometimes hidden, but often very clear political agendas or just commercial agendas, all kinds of agendas. So people get very confused. They get thrown all this information and don't know where to start. Or they then go to just WhatsApp groups, say in their church or their community, and then their cognitive dissonance narrows because now they're only believing a certain section of what's out there and everything else they distrust. So it's crucially important for us in the media, but also to get the message across and to make sure that ordinary people understand that good journalism with the eyes and ears for the public, so that they get to know things that affect them directly and things that can damage their lives or enrich their lives. And that we've seen in radio stories I did and TV stories where I did something on the plight of pensioners or went on the streets to interview sex workers, the streets of Durban for a couple of nights, and things that can make a difference. That's what good journalism does. They make a positive difference because they open people's eyes to what is happening around them and what they can do about it. And it gives them hope too. So back again to how important good journalism is and why an organization like us, the South African Editors Forum, is so important to fight for media freedom, independence, no interference from any agendas, whether it's big business, labor, or politics. We've got to be there for ordinary people because otherwise they're going to get so much false information, democracy will just fall apart.
Well, you really teed up the next thing I wanted to talk about perfectly, just the battle of the truth these days. I feel like I saw somewhere at the end of the last year how much some of these influencers are making a year, and they're not reporting on anything that's correct. They're really using what's happening in the world. And, specifically, we saw that a lot with the US elections. They're, talking about things that are not true, which is getting a lot of attention online, which is therefore driving up, dollars in their pocket. But it's really, like you said, confusing the media. So there's a lot of misinformation, government pressure, corporate interest, like you were saying, that has made journalism very complex. So I want to get, Katy, your perspective. I feel like ethical reporting is constantly under threat. Freedom is not guaranteed anywhere of freedom of speech. So I know you struggled. You've really been a strong advocate for media freedom. And really, what is the biggest threats that you, as an independent journalist, see today?
So I definitely think that the biggest threat we face as journalists, and I'm speaking about South Africa first and foremost here, is the constant abuse that some of our journalists get. There's also been a very litigious approach against some journalists in the country, some really well respected and very, very good journalists who have been reporting on some highly controversial and politicized things. And so we've seen a lot of that litigious approach. And there's one journalist in particular who I think about when I talk about this, who has ended up in court on the other side of a lawsuit against a former president. And that for me is just diabolical, because the reality is that ethical journalism requires you to double check and triple check your facts, your sources, your documents. And once you've got all of those, and you ensure that you've got all of those in check, you can't try to muzzle a journalist because you don't like what they're saying. It's got to be based on something if you're going to take a journalist to court. And it can't just be about censorship and muzzling. So I think that definitely is a threat. You know, every time things go wrong, and if we think about the political space, oh, the media is to blame. The media quoted me out of context. And I think that is dangerous. The other thing that I think is very dangerous is actually a lot of what the likes of Elon Musk is saying. You know, he constantly bashes the mainstream media and legacy media, saying, "Oh no, they're rubbish," and this is why, you know, we are, X is the only media source you must believe. I think that that's dangerous, because if you have somebody who's watching this, who's consuming this all the time, they'll almost feel emboldened to attack journalists, either verbally, physically, online, and of course, everybody can be a so-called hero as a keyboard soldier or warrior. And I think that these are very threatening signs in our society, because we've got to be able to say not all the mainstream or legacy media is as bad as some people paint us out to be. It's not the case. We've got to be able to be very discerning, as I said before. So that for me is one of the great dangers, because a very strong media, I often say, is very closely aligned to healthy democracies. So you want a strong and vibrant media that is going to challenge authority. You want that to happen, and you can't feel that every time you challenge authority that you will be muzzled or censored or sued, because that has got a chilling and rippling effect across our industry.
Yeah, I like what you said too. I think we all have opinions and we all might not agree on each other's opinions, but respecting those opinions for what they are, and just, I disagree and that's that. But you're right, just having a safe place and able to have your own voice to speak your truth based on the facts that you find and the people you talk to.
And I do want to
Qaanitah,
add, I'm
yeah,
so sorry,
please.
Melissa. I just want to come in and add very quickly to say, with freedom come responsibilities. And of course, the onus is on us as editors, running newsrooms, particularly when it comes to training and mentoring younger journalists, to ensure that we are responsible and that we do follow the basic tenets of journalism, that we are ethical in our reporting, that we are truthful, that we are unbiased, that we offer things like right of reply. So it's one thing to talk about freedoms, and we are great advocates, I think all four of us on this platform, for media freedom, but it does come with an enormous amount of responsibility, and we've got to be even more responsible than ever as journalists in order to ward off any of these verbal attacks.
Yeah, and see other people's perspective. I love that you said that. I'm glad you added that, because I think it's, I might have a perspective about something and I have experiences that have brought me to where I am in my life today. And I haven't been and seen other sides of the globe, and I don't see their perspectives because I'm living in my own kind of knowledge bubble. And so I love that you mentioned, I think it's a really good point. Qaanitah, one of my favorite words is fearless. And you have received awards for fearless reporting. And I'm curious, I know the word fearless, if you're fearless, sometimes there's backlash with being a fearless person and having opinions about things. So I'm curious, have you ever faced any backlash for your work, or how do journalists balance, truth telling with personal safety to get the point across?
Yeah. So years ago, I was part of a cohort of investigative journalists that were basically digging into the former president and his group of lieutenants that were essentially pillaging the state. So these were corrupt business people, these were corrupt politicians, and it was, and in a way, to combat the scrutiny, the public scrutiny that they were facing at the time, they had paid a huge multinational firm to come up with and orchestrate a social media campaign to rubbish the reporting, but also to personally attack, to delegitimize the journalists. And so that was probably the worst of it, because I was very young, and to kind of have your face, because they realized, a lot of politicians have now realized, or people who are on the wrong side of the law in many ways, that they don't have to come to your house with a gun to intimidate you. They can intimidate you while you're in the safety of your home through social media. And so cyber harassment has been something that I've faced for the better part of a decade, to the point where at some point I was, body shamed, at some point faced threats. My picture was photoshopped on pornography, as was a few other prominent female journalists in South Africa who were investigating the former president at the time. And since then, there has been this persistent approach that research done over the elections by a Media Monitoring Africa, which is an NGO, that said that, of the 10 top, the 10 journalists that have been harassed the most in South Africa, most of them are women. I was one of them. And so it's like you're constantly targeted, because it doesn't matter what you're reporting, because you are an irritation, you're deemed to be an irritation because of this constant and persistent search for the truth. And so I've become a lot more outspoken. I think that has enabled me to kind of use my own experience to help other people, to speak out about cyber misogyny, but also to understand this new phenomenon, because you can't deal with something if you don't understand it. And so cyber misogyny is the new form of harassment. That before you would be, death threats and envelopes, threatening letters would be sent to your door. Now people can threaten you from bot accounts that can be only linked to some random bot factory in Eastern Europe or wherever it may be. And so the idea here is to take personal experience, and that's essentially what I hope to do, and morph it into something positive that can help our colleagues to say, this is what I've experienced, the worst of it, the most extreme of it. What can we do to foolproof the system in many ways and try to protect journalists from similar abuse, but also to change what we accept as normal.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for sharing that. And thank you for the good work you do as not only being a fearless female, but helping in flipping the narrative and helping others in a way that, you're teaching them what you've went through and kind of turning and flipping the narrative. So I guess for any of our listeners, I'm kind of a second question for you. Just maybe any quick tips for women that are in journalism or speaking when they do have this happen to them. What are some tips that you want to leave them with?
The most important thing is to understand that it does have a consequence on your mental health, and that your mental health eventually impacts media freedom. So if you don't take care of your mental health, eventually you will self-censor. You will do the job of your harassers for yourself, and you will just self-censor, or if not, just leave the space entirely. And so the first thing is that acknowledgement of the enormity of and the consequence of cyber misogyny, of online harassment that we face. The second is to develop good social media hygiene, in the sense of how do you interact with people? How do your times? How do you relate to? Are you spending precious time before you go to bed on Twitter, where that provides absolutely no value to it? Have you put in safety mechanisms online where it filters out what you can and you cannot see? The third thing is to understand mental well-being as a wellness endeavor. So just like we as journalists would be prepared in terms of our physical safety. If I was going to a protest, I'll remember Katy's voice in my ear, and I will know what to do, and I'll be safe. But we don't have that similar account. So the understanding how wellness makes you a better journalist. And so that orientation that to be a good journalist, I need to be operating on 2 to 4 hours of sleep. I must, eat, drink black coffee and smoke 10 cigarettes a day. That stereotype has to be broken in the sense that to do your job, to have the mental fortitude to do what you do, and the resilience to do what we need to do, you have to be as healthy as possible. And the only way that's possible is to be preemptive about it. And so I say mental wellness is so you say it's not about wait until you are attacked and trolled on social media. Already inculcate good social media habits so that you are galvanized and protected when things happen.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I agree. Judy, as someone who's worked in the newsroom, I just want to get your perspective on how can media protect both the press's freedom as well as ethical standards with reporting?
Yeah, well, what I've tried to do over the years is empower my journalists, but also try to stop the problem at source almost. And heading back a bit of a way to 1996, I was leading the radio news and current affairs team for KwaZulu-Natal, which was providing news to over 6 million listeners from the province. But we were in the midst of political violence. We've had the successful 1994 first democratic elections, but then we had the first local government elections. And there were several political parties that were warring and killing each other in the province. And my journalists were getting in the way. And I was having meetings, individual meetings with different party leaders. And then I also decided to have a group meeting with all the party leaders at once. And I said that this has got to stop. People are trying to bribe my journalists, threaten them, drive through them at rallies, shoot at them. I had to put several into a hotel. So anyway, I said to them, look, I had set up an NGO forum of peace committee people and human rights activists and women's rights activists. And I took this problem to them and we brainstormed, and I said to the politicians, we've come up with this idea that we need a code of conduct for not only for the media, because the media, we will agree to uphold good journalism at all times, professional and ethical. But you as politicians, you must agree to code of conduct to working with the media, that you will not harass them, you will not get them targeted, you will not speak their names at rallies and get their supporters to attack reporters. And they actually signed the code of conduct I drafted. It lasted for 3 months through the elections. And then I thought, wow, we threw a very bad part of our political history. We now got a democracy, things have calmed down. But blow me down, and 30 years later, I've now updated the code, working with the Independent Electoral Commission to bring in all these things, the cyberbullying, the trolling, so much. And we did take it, our last elections in May last year, we worked with the Independent Commission, and we got a lot of support, actually, from various leaders and political parties as well. And actually, for the first time in many years, we had very few incidents of really horrid harassment of journalists in that week of the elections, voting and results and that. But the problem seems to come in not so much with the national elections, but more with local government, where feelings run very high. And we're putting that in place now for our next local government elections. So what I'm saying is it's so important what Qaanitah's talking about. The kind of experiences you have as a reporter can be very damaging. And we need to help each other with tools and help our reporters with the tools to cope with that and to counter it. But also, as SANEF, as an organization, we're working to try and reduce the incidents from the other side, if you like. By liaising directly with the politicians, a lot of them who do that. We also found a lot of taxi owners were threatening community journalists, young women getting threatened that if you do the story on my shooting up this taxi route to get it, shooting my opposition, then we will come to your house, and we'll attack you and kill your children, etc. So it's very broad. It's not just political. It's people who feel free to attack the media. And that's why we have to get the message across why the media is important to every citizen, every person, and it's to empower them to make informed choices. And secondly, to try and stop problems at source as best we can. We'll never stop them, but we can reduce them. So it's a multi-pronged approach we're trying to do. help the safety, to promote the safety and wellness of journalists. And Katie can talk more about the other strategies we've been doing as SANEF, and also to try and stop things at source, but also making a lot of fuss. Whenever there's an attack on a journalist, we put out statements, we do interviews, we cause a big ruckus, even take someone to court if necessary. So we've got a multi-pronged attack to really try and defend our journalists and promote their well-being. And that helps with media freedom. If journalists feel strong, then they're strong enough to expose corruption, to go out and get the stories that need to be told.
Yeah, that kind of tees up what I was going to talk about next. Is I'm a big believer and a big lover in diversity of perspective in all things. So not just gender diversity, but cultural diversity. And I know diversity in journalism isn't just about fairness. It really affects what stories get told, how they're framed, what perspectives come in. And I feel like, from my perspective, women and underrepresented groups and younger voices all play a really important part in shaping media and getting a really well-rounded, diverse perspective on a subject. So, Katy, I want to get, you've mentored many, many journalists. I want to get kind of your perspective, and if you think the industry is becoming more inclusive, or is there barriers that still exist with people's perspectives?
So I definitely think that barriers will always exist, regrettably. That's just the world that we live in. And so we'll always have some barriers. The onus, of course, as editors, is on us to ensure that we break those barriers down. So one of the things that I've been very, very deliberate about my entire career is ensuring that women in particular and female journalists are promoted to editorial positions, very senior positions in the newsroom, senior reporter positions. And I unashamedly say that it's been my own personal strategy, and it's also ended up being the strategy of the newsrooms that I've run. And dare I say, they've been so successful. When you're quite deliberate and purposeful about doing that. So I think barriers will always exist. It's our own mindsets, though, that need to change if we want those barriers to be broken down, and to really make sure that we are giving opportunities to younger, brighter, more diverse journalists who are coming up. And, there comes a time in our careers and as editors where you've got to say, I'm building the next generation of brilliant reporters in this country. Because if we don't build that, then what are we doing for the future of journalism? What is our media landscape going to look like? It's going to weaken it's going to weaken essentially if we don't do it. And I think by building the next and stronger generation of journalists, we've got to take a very holistic approach. I grew up in a newsroom where I had an editor who threw a computer at somebody and who punched a wall next to somebody else's face. And it was that for me is nonsense. That's just not the kind of editorial leadership that we have or need in our newsrooms right now. And I like to think that I lead in a way that encourages the heart, but also encourages people to get the very, very best out of them. And if we're not going to look at it holistically, particularly when it comes to wellness, then we are doing our teams a disservice, and we are letting our whole newsrooms down, basically. I've got a reporter, if I've got time for a very, very quick anecdote, who has spent many weeks in an area, Melissa, called Stilfontein. Now, this is a story that has just gripped South Africa because it is hundreds of illegal miners who've occupied a mine, a disused mine in the country illegally. And they've been trapped underground in some instances. In other instances, they haven't wanted to come up. And so it's been this tug of war with these illegal miners underground, and police and government above ground, come up, no, we won't, give us ARVs. So it's really been a very intriguing story. One of the desperately worrying sides of the story is that some of the miners who came up spoke about instances and wait for this, of cannibalism underground.
Mm.
And in doing a debrief with my reporter whom I'd assigned there for several weeks, he spoke about the interviews that he was doing and what these miners were telling him about frying and braaiing human flesh. Now, braaiing is a term that we use here for barbecue. It's the equivalent to barbecuing in the States. And I can't ignore that as an editor. I will be doing him and my entire team a great disservice if I ignore what he said. I've got to give him debriefs. I've got to get him to a place where he can speak about this. And you know, he mentioned that he was unable to eat red meat for a while because of what this person had told him. And so it's our approach and how we approach our newsrooms and our reporters and how we're going to mentor and guide them into the next 10, 20 years of journalism when we've moved aside. That is what is critical. And that is what editors need to be thinking about. I don't know that all of them are. I'm sure many of them are. But we really need to, as SANEF, say to our editorial teams, what are you doing to help guide, mentor, and grow in a very holistic way that is strengthening our industry?
Yeah, that's an interesting story. I appreciate you sharing. I know one of the things that popped into my head was, I know one of the things that was really popular during this US election was women's reproductive rights. And a lot of times there were male journalists talking about how things should be. And who else better to talk about women's reproductive rights than women, right? And so I want to get, Qaanitah, your perspective on diversity and representation, and the way political stories are covered. Like, how does that impact political stories from a woman's perspective, and having a diverse perspective?
Yeah, Melissa, the South African experience is phenomenal in that we have this really outstanding gender parity in newsrooms and in editorial. There's something like 60% of journalists are female in many of the big newsrooms in South Africa. So we have good representation of females. We don't have good representation of females in editor-in-chief level, which is very problematic. That's still very much a boys' club. But we have surpassed many countries in the world. I think also America in this regard when it comes to that parity. And I don't think it just happened overnight. I think it's efforts from people like Judy and people like Katy that have kind of set up this environment where you have this gender parity. So without seeming pompous, representation in the newsroom is not our issue at this point. But that doesn't mean you don't have diversity issues. What are the diversity issues? Is one, the voices that we quote in journal in our stories, right? It's still male-dominated news. Secondly, the experience of women is a woman in terms of head count. They may be parity or they may be a bit more, but in terms of benefits, in terms of pay parity, but also in terms of access to big stories, that is where the struggle lies. And so it's a second tier struggle for diversity and for gender empowerment. I think that I'm really proud when I walk into any newsroom in South Africa to see young and old, to see the mix of type of people. It's not abnormal for at one desk to have a woman in hijab, a transgender woman, and the most butch looking white man, a bodybuilder sitting and being best of friends. That's the representation of the South African experience, but also the South African newsroom experience. But that alone, the face of it, is not enough. There has to be greater, especially this is the reason why we are so passionate at SANEF to talk about cyber misogyny, because women bear most. I have done stories where I have had bylines with male colleagues, but they have gotten zero abuse with the exact same story that their name led on that particular story. and all the abuse was bottled up and directed to me. And so so when it comes to diversity, it's this tiered approach to say, yes, we may have succeeded on the big picture, but what happens now on the more everyday challenges that women face now doing the job?
Yeah, I love that you said that. I think we're getting there with full diversity, and the U.S. is definitely striving for that. But I would agree we have some work to do on our end. Judy, I want to get kind of your thoughts on what is still missing in the conversation about representation in the newsroom.
Yeah, we've come a long way. I mean, there was a time when I was the only woman editor in meetings out of about 60 editors. And I was complained that I talked too much just because I was talking a little bit more sometimes than they expected women to talk, I guess. But it's so great to see so many more women coming up. And the first thing I did was bring in lots more women into my newsroom when I became an editor, like we all have tried to promote it. But it's not only that, it's the attitudes. We are going to have to keep being vigilant because, for example, there's still a big skewing of more urban stories than rural. There are so many stories out in rural areas that we just don't get to. The newsrooms don't have the budgets. There's no time. There are too many breaking stories all the time. And the stories that affect people's lives, for example, in a rural area where children had to cross a raging river to get to school every day and they had drownings. And then when you do a TV story on that and expose it, then a bridge gets built. So that's where the media can make a difference. And usually it affects the girl child more than anything because girls are expected to stay home still in some rural households and clean or get married young, etc. So we've got a long way to go to tell a lot of the stories that are still missing. And the weight of big business and big politics is quite strong because they're often breaking stories all around us. So it's really up to us. And when we do things like Vox Pops of the people, always just say it's so important to get a wide range of men and women, young and old, and don't just get those male voices that we used to hear all the time 40 years ago. And even now, if we're not vigilant, there's a tendency to just overload panels, for example, with male voices. So we have to continue to be vigilant. We haven't got everywhere. There's still so many stories about violence against women, which is a terrible pandemic around the world and still is in South Africa. And we don't tell enough stories that help women to get their lives back in a way. We don't have enough rape crisis centers. We don't have enough in the media about how to change attitudes, maybe, or how the media can help expose these trends and looking at how the boy child is raised. There's so much more we can do to really have a more democratic society where women have the voice that they deserve, because a lot of the time women's voices, we had a focus in our annual general meeting about 15 years ago on how to engender the media. And it was shocking that only 17% of the voices quoted across media at that time were women's voices. And, we haven't got a long way ahead past that yet. And still we did glass ceiling surveys not that long ago. Women in newsrooms still getting abuse from either colleagues or their bosses. Sexual harassment still an issue. So these are all things we have to make women aware of, make sure they're empowered to deal with them and counter them, and have systems in place to help reduce the incidents. So in terms of gender, we still have a way to go, both in reflecting the stories of many women and their struggles and their successes, and also within newsrooms themselves to make sure women can really blossom to their full potential.
Yeah, that's really great. I appreciate you sharing that. Kind of in the last few minutes, I want to get each of your thoughts about maybe quickly the future of journalism. If you have any thoughts how AI and technology is going to reshape journalism. I know I often wonder, is the AI tools going to replace some of the journalism myself? And so any final thoughts, Katy? Let's start with you before we close up.
So my final thoughts, I think, Melissa, are as follows. You know, everybody talks about a news cycle, and it's the world over. It's newsrooms the world over. I refer to it as a news cyclone. And I refer to that particularly in the context of South Africa, because the news stories that we have like the cyclone effect. We really go from one big breaking story to the next, and like a cyclone, it just sweeps you up. And the reality is that's not going to end. We now add AI into that mix, and that also becomes a part of the cyclone. There is so much that we are dealing with. So whether it is our very dramatic stories, and South Africa has regrettably got very high incidents of crime and corruption, and we are on a daily basis reporting on that as media houses. And so we're getting swept up in this news cycle. We add technology and AI into it. So I think the future needs to be about somehow slowing down the eye of the storm. It's somehow, despite the eye of the storm, slowing it down just a little bit and taking cognizance so we can do deeper and better stories. Because if we're just being swept up in this and moving from story to story to story, hour after hour after hour, and I work in a radio newsroom at the moment, and you know, as the editor in chief of a radio newsroom, your deadlines are hourly, and so you run the risk of that. But being able to say, let's give our stories more depth so that our audience gets proper meaning and understanding. And let's look at what AI is going to do to our industry, because it's a huge thing. You know, in the past 24, 48 hours, DeepSeek has become a huge talking point in South Africa, but the world over. So that's what I hope that we can do going forward, is being able to say, I'm going to get out of the eye of the storm of this news cyclone, and I'm going to see what quality journalism I can do that's going to add value to our news consumers in the country, while at the same time enriching our newsroom and the media landscape.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Qaanitah, do you have any final thoughts for our listeners?
I think artificial intelligence and generative artificial intelligence has already taken a hold in how we do things, and that we cannot be having a conversation about whether we use it or we don't use it. It's already there. It's already in transcription. It's already in editing. It's already we already using it in terms of you know, automating so many parts of the news production cycle, right? What AI does is that it ought to be the tool that makes things better as technology. You know, back in the day, you would physically go and search a word in a dictionary, and then there was spell check, you know. And so the idea that it's the scary thing that we don't know about, it takes away from the fact that we need to evolve, and that journalism as a whole, the systems of journalism need to change to use this to enhance efficiency, so that we are able then to because it will never replace what we do, good journalism. And I think that the decline of legacy media was not entirely because of big tech, but also because we lost sight of good journalism. And so now this kind of low-hanging fruit, mediocre journalism, there's no place for it in a competitive world enhanced by AI. And so I think I'm excited to see new forms of storytelling. I'm excited to see how we're able to use technology to enable someone in rural Eastern Cape to tell their story, or how already imagine illegal miners at the bottom of a mine, where they were kind of blocked out for days and weeks, were able to film their environment and send that video out to reporters. So I'm really excited at the possibilities. I think that there's a whole conversation around ethics, and if we stop resisting it, we're able to then embrace it and understand, to say, this is how it helps us, this is how it harms us, like anything in the world. And so how then are we better prepared versus this kind of, we wake up one day and the world has changed and we haven't.
Yeah, that's great. Judy, any final thoughts as we close up?
Yes, I think the biggest challenge is going to be to prioritize stories that really have an impact on the audience, on people's lives directly, because the AI stories are the ones that sort of everyone gets, if you like, and there's nothing new about them, that they regurgitated a lot. So sometimes, well, often, because they go on different platforms and etc. So I think the challenge is again, what Katy and Qaanitah are saying, quality journalism, but journalism that really speaks to people and gets to their hearts and souls and is meaningful for them. So we've got to choose the right stories to cover, because you can't cover everything. And maybe AI will take the grind out of the sort of average everyday story that people need to get, like the petrol price going up and down. But then the real stories will be, okay, how is it affecting people? How does it affect people on the ground? Let's hear their stories, and really getting original stories. I think originality, truth-based originality, is going to be the absolute key.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you, ladies, so much for all the hard work you guys do and your knowledge. You're super busy. I appreciate you being here and sharing with our listeners. And that's the Executive Connect podcast.